Chapter 9. Working the territories. I've worked with a lot of veterans guys I looked up to as a young fan. The older guys in the business would have big cauliflower ears from roughing them up during the matches. Other guys just wanted to look tough, so they took hot towels and covered their ears to heat them up. Then they would pinch their ears with pliers just to make them look like cauliflower. One night, I was driving my 1967 Falcon with Gene Kiniski. Before I knew what hit me, Gene reached over, bent my ear down, and smacked me on the side of my head. I screamed, "Gene, what are you doing?" He said, "You gotta look the part, kid." I did that for Wilbur Snyder. Another veteran who nailed me when I wasn't looking was Haystacks Calhoun, but he was a real jerk. Calhoun was 6'2" and about 600 pounds, he wore overalls and a big beard and wrestled barefoot. He worked a battle royal with me one night. He wasn't even in the territory at the time. He was one of those guys who went from one territory to the next to see if he could get work. These guys didn't really care about the town. They just wanted to pay their way to next town. Calhoun had a tendency to come up from behind and hit someone with a knuckle in the back of the neck or head, or just do something shitty to his opponent. He wasn't tough at all. He was just a slob. Sure enough, one night he hit me with his knuckle in the back of my head. I had had enough of this guy. I went out of the ring and walked over to the timekeeper's table, keeping one eye on Calhoun standing in the corner. I picked up the timekeeper's hammer that he used to ring the bell, walked back to the ring, and smashed Calhoun's 10 little toes. I threw the hammer in the ring and walked away, while he was jumping around the ring like a lucha libre, screaming in pain. Jerk. I wrestled a 6-man tag once in St. Louis where I teamed with Blackjack Lanza and Waldo Von Erich against the legendary Lou Thez, Pat O'Connor, and Whipper Watson. I witnessed firsthand how not to wrestle Thez and the consequences of it. Thez was in the ring with Waldo and Waldo grabbed Lou by the top of his head to take him over. Lou had thinning hair on top, and he wasn't going anyplace. He moved out of the headlock and slapped the piss out of Waldo. Waldo tagged in Lanza. Jack knew what to do. He got Lou in a headlock, pulled him by the hair on the side of the head, and Lou went over. He just didn't want anyone to touch the hair he had left on top. Cowboy Bob Ellis solved his thinning hair problem by wearing a wig during his matches. He'd get a lot of juice, which meant he bled a lot. He'd lie on his back and cut himself underneath the rug. You never saw it. One day, Baron von Raschke Ellis and I were standing in line at the airport. Baron had a wig too, but he never wore it. He would just fold it in his pocket and goof around with it, turning his head while the wig stayed in the same direction. I asked Raschke for his wig, and I threw it on the floor in front of Ellis. I tapped him on the shoulder. "Is that yours, sir?" He frantically grabbed the top of his head. Poor Bob. I never dropped an elbow on anybody because my arms weren't that big and I didn't think it would hurt anybody. I dropped an arm on Ellis once and knocked all his teeth out. The problem was I did it backward, and he sat up. All his teeth were gone. "Oh my God," I told Bob after the match. "I'll pay you. I'll get you a new set." Bob said, "Don't worry about it. When I was in the Army, I stole 12 pairs of dentures." Chief Wahoo McDaniel was a tough man. He went to the University of Oklahoma and was a football player drafted by the Dallas Cowboys, but he also played for the Denver Broncos, the New York Jets, and the Miami Dolphins. When he made a tackle in New York, the public address announcer would say, "The tackle was made by who?" The crowd at Shea Stadium would chant, "Wahoo, Wahoo, Wahoo." He was over that much as a linebacker. I told him once on television, "Gee, Wahoo, you played for Denver, New York, and Miami. If you were any good, at least one would have kept you. The last big trade they made for you was from the Jets to Miami. Miami got Wahoo McDaniel, and the Jets got 2 snow cone salesmen and a parking lot attendant." McDaniel started wrestling in the WWF but got in a fight with Vince McMahon Sr. over money. He turned over a table full of tickets and cash and walked out. They never used him again. He was one of the few legitimate Indians in wrestling, and what an attraction he was. When he put his headdress on, Wahoo looked like the south end of a northbound peacock. But he could throw a chop like no one else. Wahoo was a rugged guy with a reputation for toughness and stories to back it up. He once ran from his dorm to downtown Tulsa on a bet. Another guy bet him that he couldn't drink a quart of motor oil. Wahoo took the bet and did it. He told me that the only effect from it was that every time he would sweat he smelled like a truck. Wahoo McDaniel had lost a loser leaves town match with superstar Bill Eadie in Columbus, Georgia. The following week, Wahoo came back with a mask as Mr. Columbus. But he wasn't smart enough to change his ring style. He still chopped because he didn't know how to throw a punch. He had never done that. That night, we wrestled a battle royal. Wahoo was trapped in the corner by a couple of guys. I went down the ring apron, took the laces from the back of his mask, and tied it to the top rope. Wahoo chopped everyone away, but he couldn't move because his head was caught on the turnbuckle. He was running up and down the ropes, yelling for the referee to untie him. There was nothing like a good rib, and that wasn't the only one. If you don't pull ribs or have a few drinks, and if you take this business too seriously, you'll go nuts. You get off a plane and you have to wait 45 minutes for a car. It's longer to wait in line than to fly sometimes. Travel is just a pain in the ass. I used to get to O'Hare at 6 o'clock in the morning from Seattle and had to change planes to get to Tampa. There's nothing to do in the morning. I would take black shoe polish and put it on the earpieces of phones. I'd watch people talking on the phone and look around. Later, I'd see them walk through the airports with their suits, luggage, and black ears. I'd pull a lot of ribs on Pepper Gomez. He was short, and when we would get in the car to go on long trips, I'd put telephone books in the front seats so he could sit up and look out the window. He'd get embarrassed and mad. When I wrestled Pepper, I never called high spots in the ring, I'd call low spots. When we would work, he would usually shoot me into the ropes and I'd give him one tackle. He would drop down, I would jump over him, and he would get it again. Then, I threw him into the ropes and he would tackle me. I would drop down, and as he came back to jump over me, I'd raise my body up about an inch and he'd catch his toe and trip. I'd whisper, "Can't you get those little legs up higher?" We were wrestling at a fairground in Portland, Indiana. The ring was on a track with a slight incline. I hit Pepper, he hit me, and I took a bump out of the ring on the low side of the ring. I ran around to the high side and rolled in. He chased me around to the same spot, but his nose was on the apron. "Very funny, amigo," he'd say. A week later, Rene Goulet and I were wrestling Dr. Big Bill Miller and Pepper at the Richmond, Indiana, ballpark on July 4th. It rained up until 2 minutes before the show. The sun came out, and all I could think of was, "Oh God, we are going to get muddy and dirty." During the match, I spotted this huge mud puddle behind the chairs. I told Pepper, "Take me out behind the chairs and nail me. I'll take a bump in the puddle." Pepper said, "Okay, amigo, but don't get me dirty." Now, what could he have been thinking? He took me out by the puddle and nailed me. I took a bump on my back, turned on my stomach, and grabbed Pepper's ankles. I pushed them together as he shouted, "No, amigo, no," and fell face down in the mud. His first instinct was to dig himself out, so I jumped on his back. He dug himself deeper in the mud with me on top of him. Pepper got up and he couldn't even see. Goulet picked him up and slammed him in the mud again. We went back to the ring, and Bill Miller, who was 6'6" and 350 pounds, yelled out, "Don't get me dirty." I sized him up and yelled back, "There's not a chance." We ended up getting counted out. The four of us went to the back and showered for an hour. I had mud and gravel where I didn't know I had places. Red Bastein liked to have some fun in the ring as well. In Portland, Playboy Buddy Rose, a guy who was about 5'1" and 310 pounds who looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy, a big, roly-poly guy was wrestling Roddy Piper with Bastein as the referee. Bastein was checking Rose, his fingertips and around his trunks and shoes, looking for something illegal. As he reached around Rose's trunks, he took his plug of tobacco out of his mouth and dropped it down the ass of Buddy Rose's white trunks, similar to what killer Carl Cox did with the Hershey bar in Louisiana. Rose didn't know what hit him. The bell rang. Rose told Piper to give him an ass bump. Rose sold it, and you could see this big spot getting bigger and bigger. Rose knew there was something in there and he knew he didn't have an accident. So he reached into his trunks, took the tobacco out of his trunks, and threw it on the mat. The people in the crowd were going nuts. That was a common theme of ribs. Andre the Giant used to shit in the tubs in Japan because he couldn't get in the bathrooms. They were more like phone booths. When Jerry Lawler first came to the WWF, there was some payback to be had. We had a show in Sacramento and I know at least 3 guys who shit in his crown, including The Undertaker and Steve Kieran. All those guys worked for him at one time in Lawler's promotion in Memphis, and they weren't treated well. I would have my fun on the interview set as well. I was being interviewed by Marty O'Neill. I walked out to the set with a picture in my pocket of 2 lesbians together. "You know what I'm going to use on Crusher tonight?" I'd ask him. "What?" I'd take out the picture and show him. "Look at that," Marty said. I'd say he's in trouble, because I've never seen anything like this.
When Wally Carbo would try to force Nick into a match, I would write down on a piece of paper the amount it would cost to get Nick in the ring.
Wally would look at it and sigh, "Oh pal." The note would always say, "Fuck you, Wally." Mr. Fuji, a longtime wrestler and manager, was a great ribber on the plains. Guys would be out all night partying, and they'd want to sleep on the plane. Fuji would say to them, "Take this, brother," and offer them a halcyon. They'd be so out of it, he could perform surgery on them. Not Fuji. He would just paint their nails and shave their eyebrows off. One of the nasty boys came home one night to his hotel room after partying. His wife was trying to call him and couldn't get a hold of him. The next day he was sleeping it off on the plane, and Fuji painted a black nose and whiskers on him. He got off the plane, went home, and his wife asked where he was. "I was in my room all night. I didn't do anything." Keep in mind that he was saying this standing in front of her looking like a pussycat. That wasn't the only way to get a guy in trouble with his wife. I heard of other ribbers putting lipstick on and kissing the other guy's shirt collars or underwear so their wives would see it when they did the wash. I had my share of fun on planes, and not just fighting the passengers. I discovered how to lock and unlock bathrooms from the outside. Where it says occupied or vacant, there's a little nub in there to unlock it in case someone is in there getting sick. But that meant you could lock it too. On one trip, Pedro Morales was sitting in the front row of the plane while I was sitting in the back right next to the bathroom. The plane took off and I could see him looking back at the bathroom sign. I knew he had to go. The seat belt sign turned off, and I saw Pedro get up. Before he could see what I was doing, I shut the bathroom door, popped the sign over to occupied, and sat back down. Morales walked up to the bathroom and saw the occupied sign. "Oh shit," he said, and started knocking on the door. "Amigo?" No one answered. "Amigo, I've got to piss." He finally made his way back to his seat, but he kept looking back. I got up and opened the door, and he saw me. He jumped up as I shut the door and locked it. He ran back to the bathroom door and saw it said occupied. I noticed that he was wearing a pair of gabardine pants, which was funny because he always had trouble pronouncing that word. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted at the door. "I'm going to piss my gabardinos." At the World Bodybuilding Federation event, the WWF had David Heckner, who has a twin brother named Earl that also works for the Federation, serve as an agent. Linda McMahon walked up to me and said, "I'm so embarrassed. I can't tell David and Earl apart. Which one is he?" Of course I said, "It's Earl." A half hour later, David walked up to me and said, "I'm nervous as hell. Linda McMahon keeps calling me Earl. I don't have the guts to tell her I'm David." I didn't say anything. I found Linda and told her, "Linda, I made a mistake. That's David." I went back to David and said, "Keep answering to Earl." That went on for the whole day. A very popular rib was called a Mabel. A new guy would come into the territory, and we would find him the most attractive arena rat, or wrestling groupie, which was hard to do if you've ever seen them. We'd introduce him to her, and he'd make friends with her. She was our queen rat. So they would make a date to go to her place that night. She'd mix him a drink and tell him to go in the next room and make himself comfortable. The front door would open and she'd shout, "Oh no. What are you doing home?" She'd run into the next room and shout, "It's my husband. Run out the window." The guy would be crawling out the window when the husband would run in with a gun filled with blanks and shoot her. The wrestler is out the window running down the street with his pants tucked under his arms or just a pair of argyles on. The husband was one of the boys with a blank pistol. He'd show up for work the next day, and we would tell him what happened. Some guys would get mad. Others would laugh. Wrestlers would always figure out a way to turn the tables. There were two guys in Canada who wrestled as the Kelly twins. They were identical twins, and it was impossible to tell them apart. One would meet a girl and take her up to their room while the other was hiding in the bathroom. When he was done being romantic, he would go into the bathroom and the other would come out. After he was done, he would go into the bathroom and it would start all over again. The girl thought she found the greatest lover of her life. The best ribber in the business was Vic Christie. He picked up King Curtis, who had just flown in from Hawaii, at the airport hotel in Los Angeles at 10 o'clock in the morning for a show at 8 o'clock that night. Curtis got in the car and they drove away. They were driving through the valleys and the mountains. Curtis asked, "Do we have time to stop and eat?" "No," Vic said. "We gotta go. I'm in the first match." They pulled up to the building about 10 minutes before the show started, after a long day in the car in addition to Curtis flying in from Hawaii. They walked in the building and Vic told Curtis, "I'm going out of town, but someone will take you back to the hotel." Curtis asked, How much do I owe you? Never mind, Vic said.
Well, thank you.
Vic's match ended, and he left the building. Curtis found Steve for his ride. They got in the car and drove about 2 blocks to the hotel where Curtis and Vic met that morning. Vic drove through the mountains and the desert, all the way to Vegas and back. That big Hawaiian was sitting there soaking wet because Vic's car didn't have air conditioning. I made my own fun on the road. Keep in mind that I didn't go to work until 4 o'clock in the afternoon and arrived at the building at 7 o'clock. We'd be done by 11 o'clock, so I had all night to party.
Wrestlers always had to be careful where they went.
There were a lot of bars filled with guys who thought it was fake and they could beat a wrestler, especially me being a manager and a weasel hiding behind people all my life. People knew that they'd have trouble fighting Hogan, but they could beat me. Some fans were so drunk they couldn't get up and fight.
I would bait them and make fun of them.
I'd even order drinks and put them on their tab. The guy would wake up the next morning and think he had a hell of a time with me. When you're traveling around the country, you can run into all kinds of different people in the business.
You can run into big guys like Andre the Giant, and you can run into little people, the midget wrestlers.
I knew this one midget by the name of Fuzzy Cupid. He was in his late 40s or 50s. You honestly could not tell, about 38 inches tall. He had a protruding forehead, orange blonde hair, and a goatee to match. He was just a miserable little creature. Blackjack Lanza used to tell him, "You have breath like a dead goat, you surly, tyrant little creature." He was stuck one night. We were going to Elkhart, Indiana, from Indianapolis, and little Fuzzy didn't have a way to get there. We said, "Come on, Fuzz, we'll take you with."
He sat in the back seat, but his breath was so bad, Lanza made him lie in the boot of his Buick convertible.
Fuzzy crawled in the boot and lay down like a cocker spaniel as we headed off to Elkhart. We drove into Kokomo, Indiana, at about 2 o'clock in the morning. Next to Kokomo was a town called Brazil, which was the summer and winter home for the circus. We needed gas and pulled into a station with Fuzzy fast asleep in the boot. Lanza and I saw the attendant sitting in the station with his Gomer Pyle hat on, and we decided we were going to have some fun with him.
Gomer was half asleep with his feet up on the table. He must have weighed 400 pounds, but he squeezed himself into a medium shirt.
We woke him up to tell him that we had found something. "What did you find?" Gomer asked. "We found some circus midget down by the river, and he was chewing on some woman's ankle." He said, "You've got to be kidding." I said, "No, we captured him and trapped him in the boot of our car." We desperately wanted to get Gomer to wake Fuzz up, because we knew Fuzz, being his miserable self, was going to kill him for interrupting his nap. He followed us to the car, but what we didn't know was that Fuzzy was wide awake. The guy walked up to the car, convinced that 2 strangers had captured a circus freak who had bitten a woman's ankle. As Gomer approached the passenger side of the Buick, Fuzzy was getting out of the boot. Fuzz confronted him, pushed the 400-pound attendant aside, and said, "Get the hell out of my way." The terrified Gomer was face to face with the ankle biter. He ran away screaming. He kept running, and we never saw him again. He never came back to the station. We filled our car up with free gas and drove away with Fuzzy back in the boot. There was this young guy who showed up in the promotion, and he'd always bring his girlfriend to spot shows. We'd spot him driving down the road, so we would try to get ahead of him. We'd pop the trunk, and a midget would stand up, playing with himself. We'd do that every few miles until he backed way off. We never saw him again. The midgets would always drive with us to Windsor, Ontario. When it came time to pay the toll, we popped the trunk, and Sky Low would pop up and pay the toll, scaring the hell out of the attendant. Sky Low would always wear a fedora-style hat. He would sit at the bar, take it off, and set it on the stool next to him. Inevitably, Pat Patterson would sit on it. Sky would always be in a mood to fight. He would get drunk and then ride his bike home. Usually, he would fall off his bike when he got there. His wife, who was not a midget, would beat the shit out of him for it. I was driving from Chicago with Guy Mitchell, Gene Kinniski, and Wilbur Snyder. We were all drinking beer, and the weather was snowy. Wilbur couldn't see it all, but he's showing us how you can go 100 miles an hour in the snow as well as you can go 20. I said, "Yeah, but you can't stop the same." Gene Kinniski had pictures of his children on the dash, pleading with Wilbur, "Please, please don't do this." Baron von Raschke, Pepper Gomez, and I went through Chicago one night in 1973 during the gas crisis. We drove from Fort Wayne to do a television show. I ran out of gas on the Dan Ryan in the hood. I have a 5 feet 10 inches Mexican with an iron stomach in the backseat. I have the Clawmaster sitting next to me, and the Weasel is driving. We were in trouble. I said. Pepper, you stay in the car. Rashki and I are going to find a gas station. We hailed a cab to take us to a gas station to buy a can of gas. We drove for a half hour in the snow. We couldn't find a gas station, so naturally we went to a bar. We picked up a case of beer to drink because we were going to have to sit in the car anyway. While we were gone, the local police discovered our car and Pepper sitting in the back seat. The cop asked Pepper, "Why were you sitting in the car?" He said, "My friends went to get gas." "But you were on the highway." "If you got rear-ended, that's okay. I don't sell the neck," Pepper said. Selling is wrestling slang referring to when a wrestler reacts to or sells what is happening to him, for instance, snapping their head back and acting woozy after a punch. The cop had no idea what he meant. It was at that point that Rashki and I showed up, of course with a case of beer. The police ignored the alcohol and pushed the car off the Dan Ryan and up the off-ramp with their car. Eventually, we all ended up in the parking lot of a closed Clark gas station. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and we thought we might freeze to death. We started drinking beer until we fell asleep. I woke up at 7 o'clock and discovered that the sun was up. I looked across the street, and there was an all-night gas station that we didn't see the night before because of the snow. That's right. The Weasel, the Clawmaster, and the Iron Stomach drank a case of beer across the street from an open gas station in the parking lot of a closed gas station. Rashki turned to me and said, "That's why they call you the Brain." When I toured Japan in the early 70s, I found out that in some hotels you could get both massages and special massages. Having decided to stay in one of those hotels, I told the desk clerk that I wanted a massage. I went back to my room, showered, and waited. Later, I heard a knock at the door and opened it. There was the bellman from downstairs standing there, but he was with a blind guy who looked to be in his 70s. I said, "I don't think you understand." Knowing that he didn't speak English, I took my hands and made the motion of a woman's figure. Realizing the mistake, he said, "Ah, so," and left. I put some cologne on and waited some more. 20 minutes later, he came back with a woman who was 65 years old and blind. I gave him the money. He said, "Ah, so." I said, "I am." Some guys would travel with the blades that they used to whack themselves with during matches to make themselves bleed. They used the same blade for months. They'd keep them all in a medicine bottle and pick out the one that they were going to use. Mine always went into the toilet after one time. I would always carry the blade in an inside pocket of my trunks, a blade pocket. I'd reach in, grab it, and rake the guy's eyes. I'd pull my hand back where I kept the blade. When I went down, I'd push the blade up and move my head. Then, I'd grab the guy by the trunks, punch him, and put the blade in there. I'd always tell him to not reach down there, or take a piss before he got back to the dressing room. Some guys were terrified of blading. I remember Wilbur Snyder would whimper when it was time for him to blade. I'd say, "Come on, Willie. Time to whack." He'd whimper, "Willie, come on." He'd whimper some more. "Come on, we've got to go home." He'd carry on. Then, when the blade hit his skin, he'd cry out so loud. The guy in the last row heard it. It didn't hurt. It was like a paper cut. When you bladed a guy and the blood wasn't coming out good enough, you either told him not enough, you punched him to open it up a little more, or you grab his nose and tell him to blow. I used to do it too to get the blood to flow. I never let anybody cut me, because I didn't know where the blade was or where the other guy had it. You didn't think about AIDS or herpes in those days, or about catching anything. I worked one night against Dr. X in the AWA. He was wrestling me in a match where he had to defeat me in 10 minutes. I think the finish was that he would beat me in 9 minutes. 2 minutes into the match, he said, "Get your juice now." I wasn't paying attention to myself. As I'm whacking myself with the blade, he pulled me up and I hit an artery. Mind you, I'm wearing blue and white boots, pink tights, pink trunks, and a pink singlet. All this with blonde hair. I went back to the dressing room after the match, bleeding heavily. Oliver Humperdinck met me in the back. At that time he was still using his real name, John Red Sutton. He was an usher at the building and a Santa Claus at the Minneapolis Donaldson's department store. He was just getting into the business. He used to carry my blades for me and place them on a chair when I needed them. Wally Carbo told him, "Take him to the hospital. That's not going to stop." So Humperdinck took me to the hospital on a Saturday night at 11 o'clock. Every drunk in St. Paul was in the waiting room. The doctor sewed me up with 13 stitches. He told me not to wash it off because of chlorine in the water. I had to wash around it. I walked into the waiting room where the drunks were sitting, and I was covered in dried blood from head to toe wearing my pink jacket that said Heenan on the back.
Good evening, I said. I'm Dr. Heenan.
We've just lost one in OR, but as soon as I scrub out, I'll be right out to talk to you. You could see the drunks file out of the room. They weren't staying. This is the end of this chapter. I hope you enjoyed this program. Please like and subscribe. Comments help the algorithm. See you next time.